What's up, guys? Raf here. Today I want to take you through my general process of creating and releasing music. Similar to a lot of creators out there, I break down my entire process into different pillars for organization and management, and each of those pillars consist of even smaller tasks that help me advance throughout this process. What precedes each of the pillars in my process are intention or lack thereof. Either I can deliberately sit down and say, okay, I want to make a song that sounds like this, that addresses this topic, that evokes these emotions, or I can just throw a dart and create to create. I can just write whatever lyrics that don't have to necessarily mean anything at the time. I can create a beat that I'm not sure is going to be going into a specific direction. It really all depends, but once I determine what I want to do between those two processes, I'm going to employ each of the following pillars. Pillar one is lyric writing and beat making hyphen composition. I don't execute either of those two things in a particular order all the time. It's just whatever feels right at the moment. I do have a lot of lyrics from over the years in old phones, in my current phone, and in old notebooks stockpiled. So if I want to pull from one of those an entire verse or a chorus, or just a stanza, a line, a song title, whatever it may be, I can pull from one of those if I want to get started with something in that regard. Or I have a lot of beats stockpiled in my computer, and a lot of them are unfinished, so generally I could just pick one that is in the vein of the feeling that I want to capture and further build on it, add a lot more production stuff, and kind of get the ball rolling that way. If I do start from scratch, it could be drawn from something as simple as creating a brand new voice memo that has a melody that I wanted to capture, but I wasn't in the studio at the time to capture it. I could just write random words or song titles or just phrases that might mean something later on in my process. Or if I'm going to be making a brand new beat, even though I have a whole lot of unfinished ones already, fucking bad habits of musicians, right? I could get started on creating a drum pattern with this guy, my Akai MIDI controller for drums. I could play something on my Casio keyboard or just anything of the like. Just throw a dart and get started with something new. Regarding beat making, I tend to be more composer and theory oriented as opposed to sample based producing. Not that there's anything wrong with that, obviously. I recently started getting my hands dirty chopping samples and I'm enjoying the process. But just in 2.5 years, almost 3 of making beats and just generally making my own music, I've always just preferred to create something as original as possible. It's just always felt a little bit more natural to me. Yeah, that's kind of where I like to go with it. Once I have a skeleton of an instrumental to go off of, I pull from my stockpiled lyrics, song titles, and concepts, and I pick and choose which ones match together best, and then I work backwards, if you will, which is going to be like, okay, I want this song to say this. How am I going to emphasize that in the chorus? How am I going to emphasize that in the verses? And break it down to like a more microstructure, if you will. Like, okay, we start off with addressing this, addressing this, addressing this, and it's going to be kind of like building a case, if you will. Like if you're a lawyer, your chorus is your thesis, and maybe 4 bars are going to be one fact of your case, another 4 bars are going to be another fact of your case, etc., etc. It's almost like all these different pieces accumulate and they contribute to the bigger picture that you're trying to present to the listener. You know, I'm a huge fan of main topic and subtopics. That way I can use subtopics and bounce off of them and write lyrics that specifically address those subtopics. Yet each lyric, each word, and each subtopic are all going to be contributing upwards to the main topic. I think one of the biggest pitfalls of not establishing subtopics underneath your main topic is that you as a songwriter can get lost in not having a clear direction as to what you want to write about specifically. If you just have lyrics and words working upwards without any specific direction toward the main topic, you're going to be writing a lot of vague stuff. You're going to be getting a little bit off track, and it's just going to be a big mess in your project. So I try to avoid that. Pillar number 2 of my process is recording. A very, very important thing that precedes the day that I record the final draft of the song would be to memorize the lyrics by way of scratch vocals and demo tracks. I achieve demo tracks in a few different steps. The first being take my handwritten lyrics, which are probably messy because I'm scrambling to capture these ideas as they come to me, and I type the lyrics out so I can read it properly, and I take highlighters and color code and mark the words that I want to emphasize or that I must have a specific nuance for in the performance. That way I can capture it when I'm creating the demo recordings in scratch vocals. Scratch vocals are where I allow myself to have the biggest margin of error. Because this is still me hashing out the meat and potatoes of the song, I record probably dozens and dozens of takes of my lyrics. And when I take those takes, I comp them for the best sections. So it's as close as I can possibly get to what I would want the final recording to sound like. And once I have the demo track comped out, I bounce the recording down to a MP3 or M4A in stereo, and I just put it in my phone and in my computer. That way I can listen back constantly, the way that you would listen to any other song, and then you would just innately memorize those lyrics if you're paying attention. I do that with my own demo recordings, so I have the lyrics themselves and each of their nuances pretty much down to a T. So when I go into final recording date, I can kind of breeze through it more or less, just effortlessly finish the recording with as high energy as I can. So if I do need to do extra takes, I'm not fatigued in my vocal cords and my energy hasn't withered away throughout a long session where I keep doing X, Y, and Z over and over again. Once we get to final recording dates, I have two findings that are very important. The first being, do not eat perhaps 1 or 2 hours before your recording session of the final performance. I don't know the specific science of why that's beneficial, but just in my experience, and what I've heard from other singers and what I've read, leaving that kind of gap between your last meal and your recording session is better for your vocal performance. The second would be to execute a vocal warm-up. Please do that. Don't be too cool for school, because this is you priming yourself to execute the best possible performance that you can, because this is what's going to be heard on your song forever. You know, it's like saying you're a gymnast, but you're not going to limber up properly before you do all these crazy moves, or you're a fighter, but you're not going to sprawl and hit pads and break a little bit of a sweat before you walk out of the tunnel for a scrap. So do that before you record. Once we start, I find a happy medium in executing recordings by doing passes of individual song sections. Example, you do the verse entirely top to bottom, you do the chorus top to bottom, you do the bridge top to bottom, etc., etc. And I find doing it that way to be a happy medium between knowing that you can pull off these song sections live and you're not going to be punching it in line by line and then you can't recreate that when you hit the stage. But equally, if you do an entire song top to bottom, your energy might start withering away throughout the latter half of the song. You might start feeling fatigue and it's not going to sound as good. To me, this method presents a good enough balance of preserving the artist throughout however long the recording session is, but equally, you're not presenting yourself a false sense of security by punching in every line, but instead you're executing it section by section consecutively. However long this verse is, however long this chorus is, you're executing it at the highest level and you're capturing all these nuances that you wanted in your performance, and you're doing it top to bottom. You know that you can do it as the performer. There's no studio tricks there. I take this approach as a rapper who produces and vocal produces myself, because aside from me not wanting to spend all day long doing the same lines over and over again and spending time that could be toward other tasks, I treat it as if I were to go into a commercial facility where they're going to be charging exuberant prices for studio time by the hour. Engineers are getting paid X amount of dollars per hour. Other people in the studio have to record. So that's why my approach is, when I walk into the room, I want to have an airtight operation. I want to be able to go in there and execute this cleanly and quickly as possible. And that's not to say that I think I'm going to breeze through every single studio session I go into. I know that in the moment, sometimes you're going to discover things spontaneously that you want to sprinkle in last minute, and you should make the time for those things. But my main thing is that an elongated studio session is not going to occur on account of my lack of preparation as the vocalist. Pillar number 3, editing. Certainly, editing requires a high level of meticulousness. Therefore, I prefer to edit my songs on a different day than the recording date. In doing that, I'm able to have fresh ears and as high energy as I can possibly can, so I can capture all the things that are good and bad about the performance and edit them accordingly. Certainly, vocal comping is no small feat that you just can't breeze through. When I comp my vocals, it's all predicated on being able to record my vocals very similarly to each other, hence the memorization and knowing the nuances that you're going to employ in your recordings. But if you like a specific phrase or word in one take more than another, you still need to make sure that specific section flows smoothly in terms of tonality, volume, timing, etc. with the rest of the take that you're splicing up together. If it's going to sound like it doesn't belong there, then it's going to be more of a distraction and doing more harm to the recording than good. The idea behind comping is to create the perfect take, if you will, but it gets into that territory as well where you as the producer have to think and assess, hey, maybe this is starting to sound a little too robotic. It sounds too perfect to where it doesn't even sound real or human or conversational anymore. And you need to make the decisions to where maybe I like this slightly more flawed performance than I do if all these sound technically perfect, but it starts losing its soul. So that's a decision that you need to make as the editor and producer if you're doing all those roles together. Certainly when you have your editing hat on, you'd want to really assess how the beat plays off of the vocals and vice versa. A lot of times you'd be catching these choke ups that you want to add in your production where you didn't necessarily hear it before the vocals were added to the track, but now you're hearing it, you're thinking, I could subtract this part, I could add a drum fill here, I could add on these sound effects that makes it more lively and it ping pongs off of the words that I'm saying. Basically all these different things that are making the song more lively and more interactive within itself, and also perhaps with the listener. You know, if it's just a beat with lyrics slapped on it and then that's just it likely is going to sound a lot more sterile, a lot less lively, if you will. So certainly those are things to pay attention to. You know, a very common phrase that you'll hear in music production is tension and release. And basically it creates a stimuli of taking things out and putting things back into the arrangement that will be a lot more pleasurable for the listener to hear when they hear your song. Another small yet very important thing to do would be to bounce in place small pieces of audio, especially ones that are sprinkled throughout a song. Certainly you want to do this because it consolidates all these little pieces into one big audio file that keeps them locked in place and in sync with the rest of the performance of the song. For as high performance as computers are these days, they're still fallible. So you want to take as many precautions as you can to keep your performance pieces in sync and locked in so they're going to be presented the way that you wanted them to be heard. Because I remember my first go around when I first put out music, the Calle de Cielo song from March 2024, we had a recurring riser sound effect that would transition from the verses to the chorus. We thought, you know, everything was all nice and dandy, but in actuality, because we didn't bounce the risers in place, the first one that transitioned out of verse 1 into the chorus was maybe 2 seconds late, and we gave it to our engineer, and he thought it was in place because he was just under the impression we double checked when we hadn't, and we ended up having him mix with an out of place riser, and it was just a giant fucking mess. So certainly bouncing in place allows you to consolidate things in sync with the way that you wanted them to be heard. Another thing to do as an editor would be to add crossfades between cut-up splices in your project to avoid pops and clicks. The final thing on my editing list would be to create censored recordings of my lyrics, because I do intend for my music to be played in a lot of arenas, the way that you guys perhaps do as well. I take my explicit recordings out of Logic and I put them into Pro Tools and use Verify, which is an audio suite plugin, VARI-FI. And essentially what that allows me to do is chop and pitch shift down the explicit part of my recording so it sounds like a backspin or a sweep, and it totally erases the explicit content. Pillar number 4, sending off the song to get mixed and mastered. A lot of people execute their own mixes and masters. I don't at the moment, even though I'd like to in the future, and that's a count of 1, I work out of an untreated bedroom, and 2, I am still a firm believer that it serves a project well if you get a second pair of ears that has an objective take on it that isn't as emotionally invested in the project as you are, because us as the creators, we get so caught up in our idea of what things should sound like when someone else can come in with fresh ears and an unbiased perspective, and they can point you in a direction that may end up suiting your project better. To get my project into the engineer's hands, I send out the raw, multi-track recordings out of my DAW into a labeled folder with the song title, the key signature, and a tempo of the song. And I include a PDF of directions that I want for the mix, as well as a list of deliverables that I want back from him, which in my case, because my engineer does both my mixing and mastering, I ask him for the wet, aka processed multi-track recordings, which I'll take and print down into stems on my own Pro Tools rig. And I ask him for 16-bit and 24-bit master sound recordings so I can have both digital masters and also ones that I can use for CDs. And specifically the 4 that I've asked for on my last project are the explicit master sound recording, the censored master sound recording, the instrumental, and the show mix. And for those of you who don't know, a show mix is the instrumental married to the background vocals, so you can use that track to perform live. After compensating the engineer and receiving my deliverables, I take the master sound recordings and convert them down in my own DAW to M4A and MP3 from the WAV file that I get back. And that's just so I have a variety of file types, so wherever I need to submit this record, it's ready to go and it's accessible for me in any format that I possibly need. If I need to submit it to a radio station and they specify M4A or MP3, then it's just already right there. And in having all these different formats of these different versions of the recordings, I embed the metadata into them for when they're uploaded into whatever internet platform it's going to be in. Therefore, it's known that it's mine. Pillar number 5, copyright registration. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but the essence of copyright registration is to establish public record that a work or said works belong to you, and that anybody who wants to use it is going to have to pay, whether they want to pay legally upfront for using your work, or if they take your work without permission and you can prove that damages were caused, that you can pursue that in court and you have a legal right to do so because you are the owner of said infringed work. I'm not sure about the specifics of it, but in my experience, my recent experience in getting my CROSSHAIRS EP registered with the Copyright Office, it was more affordable to register it pre-release date than it is post-release date. I'm not 100% certain why. If someone knows, could you please tell me, because I'm curious about that. I guess from an expense standpoint, it's more beneficial to register it before dropping it. Pillar number 6, artwork design. This is definitely more subjective than the previous pillar, but essentially just create a visual that best represents you and your sound. I take great pleasure in assuming the responsibility of my visuals. I'm somewhat proficient in Adobe Photoshop as well as Adobe Express, and what I like to do is have my brother take raw photos of me that capture the essence that I want for my project, and I doctor up and tweak and chop up these raw images into badass artwork that I enjoy making and I enjoy looking at in final product form. In creating these visual assets, I certainly take into account the platforms that these album covers and visuals are going to be posted on. In my specific case, I use DistroKid as my digital distributor, and they put on their upload page that they recommend a 3000 pixel by 3000 pixel square image. So I set my Photoshop project to that, and once I finish the design, I scale it down to a 1080 pixel by 1080 pixel for an Instagram square. According to Instagram, that's what's recommended for a square post where you don't have to crop the image. You can present it in its full size, just perfect enough for that format. Pillar number 7, uploading my music to a digital distributor. As I mentioned, I use DistroKid. However, there's also CD Baby, TuneCore, Lander, and a whole plethora of others. Basically, find which one works best for you. In the process of uploading your music to a digital distributor, be sure you have your credits and splits all lined up and in order so you can punch in all that information accordingly when you're administering the records in this regard. Towards the end of the process in uploading with a digital distributor, you can establish your pre-order dates, your release date, and also which specific section of the song is going to be the preview when somebody wants to hear a sample of the song before they commit to listening to it or purchasing it. Pillar number 8, and this is where it gets a little fuzzy because I am not a music business guru. I'm still navigating this part of the journey on my own, but this is going to be registering your songs with a performing rights organization and SoundExchange. Basically, a performing rights organization collects royalties for songwriters when entities want to use their music publicly. The noteworthy performing rights organizations are BMI, ASCAP, and the invite-only CSAC. Entities who want to use your music publicly pay a blanket licensing fee, which gets then funneled from them to your PRO down to you. Short and sweet, SoundExchange is a neighboring rights organization designated by the United States government to collect royalties for creators when their music is played internationally. The 9th pillar of this process for me is promotion. I do not have this part of the process entirely figured out to where I'm proficient and I can benefit from it. The only ways that I've promoted myself since dropping my EP back in March would be posting on social media the visuals and announcing myself that my record is out, posting on this YouTube channel whenever I have video ideas, and submitting to college radio. Certainly, I have a lot to figure out in this department, but we live to fight another day, man. So to recap the pillars of my process: lyric writing and composition / beat making, recording, editing, sending out to get mixed and mastered, registering with the Copyright Office, artwork design, setting up with a digital distributor, registering with a PRO and SoundExchange, and promotion. Thank you guys for watching. If my overview of my general process from seeing music through from idea inception to putting it out in the world has helped inform you guys' journeys, or if you just enjoyed this, I appreciate you guys for stopping by. See you next time.